When I saw that Sunday Express headline and the associated article, I thought it was very important, and as you have just indicated, Prime Minister, it's very important to educate the public with respect to the true facts. Now, the fact is that as of Friday, the 9th of June, 2023, which is just a couple of days ago, the net asset value of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund was US 5.466 billion. That is just over 37 billion Trinidad dollars. That is an increase of US $754 million, or just over 5 billion Trinidad dollars, in the actual value of the fund over the last 9 months since September 2022. And if you exclude a deposit that we made in accordance with the law, and it has been a very long time. I think the last time deposits were made in accordance with the law in terms of surplus revenues from petroleum was somewhere around 2007, 2008. Because after that, the deposits made to the fund by the former government were made with respect to a deficit budget where they borrowed money to put money into the Heritage Fund. But we actually generated a surplus and therefore used surplus funds to make a deposit to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. We made that in December 2022. So if you remove that deposit, the fund has generated comprehensive income of almost $600 million in the last 9 months. So the figures, the data, the conclusions in that Sunday Express article are 8 months old, out of date, misleading and wholly irrelevant, because the value of the fund fluctuates over time, as do all sovereign wealth funds. And I'll give you another bit of information. And by the way, this document I'm reading from will be circulated to all media. The net asset value of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund has increased by US $327 million, over TT2 billion, in the last 6 months, between January 23 and June 23. And this is without any deposits into the fund from the government during that period. If you look at the volatility of the global equity market, because this is what is important, you can't adopt a simplistic or amateurish approach to data. You must do research. So if you look at the volatility of global markets in the last couple of years, looking at our own fund, during the two-month period, May 15th to June 19th, 2020, in the middle of COVID, the fund increased in value by $297 million, 2 billion TT in just 2 months. More strikingly, again during COVID, during the 2-week period, April 3rd, 2020 to April 17th, 2020, that's just 14 days, the value of the fund increased by US $286 million, again close to 2 billion Trinidad dollars. So if, and I have to use this word, if the inverted logic of the Express article is to be followed, the fund managers should have received a national award for increasing the value of the fund by $2 billion in 2 weeks. But you have to have a long-term vision for these things. It's all investment funds have long-term objectives. Now, the annual report of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund for the 12-month period ending September 30th, 2022, which seems to be the basis for that article, was laid by me in Parliament on the 3rd of February 2023, 5 months ago. And it has therefore been in the public domain for 129 days. It's curious that the Express waited 5 months to comment on that report. Now, it's public knowledge that 2022 was an extremely challenging year for market players and sovereign wealth funds, with volatile geopolitics, high inflation, rising interest rates, especially in the United States, very important for anybody who wants to do a proper analysis of global equity markets. When interest rates rise, money moves out of the stock market into fixed deposits. That's what happens. When interest rates drop, money moves out of fixed deposits into the stock market. So in 2022, you had geopolitics, inflation, rising interest rates, which resulted in a very negative return for stocks and bonds all over the world. It was the first year in history that the size of the global equity market shrunk. There were heavy falls in stock and bond markets, and that cut the combined value of the world's sovereign wealth funds for the first time ever. In fact, there's a report by a report on state-owned investment vehicles by a highly regarded industry specialist called Global SWF Company. They found that the value of assets managed by sovereign wealth funds around the world dropped by $900 billion US dollars, 6 trillion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. I'll take Norway's wealth fund, for example. Norway is wealth fund is one of the world's largest investors. In fact, it was only recently overtaken by China in January of this year. Norway's wealth fund posted a record loss of 1.64 trillion crowns. That's the Norwegian currency, or US $164 billion in 2022. It lost 15% of its value in 2022 and ended a 3-year run of soaring profits as stocks and bonds were hit by the Ukraine war and inflation. That's what happened in 2022. In Saudi Arabia, the market value of the general index decreased by 528 billion reals, 142 US billion dollars, 24% decline. Other funds all over the world reported similar difficulties. The China Investment Corporation, which manages the People's Republic of China Fund, said in November 2022, when it published its 2021 report, that it was being confronted with a complex and trying external environment in 21 going into 2022. The China Fund, a private equity fund, which invests in Chinese companies, lost 24% of its value in 2022. So there's nothing unique about the performance of Trinidad and Tobago's Heritage and Stabilization Fund in 2022. And more importantly, like other sovereign wealth funds around the world, our fund has recovered strongly to the tune of over US $700 million since the close of the last fiscal year in September of last year. The Sunday Express article contained none of this, no research, no analysis, no information on the performance of global equity markets or wealth funds between 2022 and 2023. It failed to educate and inform the public. And just an interesting point, the graphics in the article are interesting because you have the front page major headline announcing a US $913 million loss, and then a very small, very difficult to read box in the upper right-hand corner of the article, where I will have to say it is reluctantly acknowledged that the fund experienced a turnaround in the last 3 months of 2022. But that little box didn't tell you that between September 2022 and December 2022, our Heritage and Stabilization Fund increased its value by $400 million US dollars, just 3 months. So this very misleading article was followed by an equally uninformed editorial in the Express today, which bemoaned the fact that the fund lost 16% in 2022, and according to that editorial, this will become political fodder in the upcoming local government election. But the editorial writer did not understand the irrelevance of its irresponsible commentary, since by June 2023, this month, the fund has increased its value by 16% since that report in September 2022. I also want to make the point that withdrawals from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund over the last 7 years and 9 months have totaled almost US $1.9 billion. This was used to fund the national budget in difficult periods, COVID and so on. And when you take that withdrawal of $1.9 billion over the last almost 8 years and the adverse temporary effects of that very challenging year in 2022, and you understand that the net asset value of the fund on June 9, 2023 is approximately US 5.5 billion. Guess what the asset value was when we came into office? 5.5 billion. So it means that this fund has generated 12 billion Trinidad dollars in comprehensive income since we assumed office in 2015. Let me say that again. The Heritage and Stabilization Fund has generated 12 billion Trinidad dollars in income since September 2015, and its value today is the same as it was then when we came into office. And I will finally say, I noticed the usual uninformed commentary by the usual critics, especially those at the university. I would simply say that this kind of uninformed commentary based on erroneous and misleading articles is just unhelpful.
For those who may not understand the workings of a sovereign fund, like the HSF, for example, does something like the impact of Russia's war with Ukraine on the international energy markets, does that have an impact one way or the other in terms of, let's say, the performance you described of the fund?
Of course. And there's something I didn't want to go on for too long, but there's a point I wanted to make. If you look at the quarterly report, which is on the Ministry of Finance website for the period October-December 2022, if you go to page 3 of that report, you will see the return on the benchmark. Now, the fund managers are benchmarked against an international benchmark called the Strategic Asset Allocation Benchmark. And the performance of the fund managed by the managers is measured against that benchmark. So if you look at the performance for October-December 2022, you will see that the return on the fund, just for that period, and this is not an annualized return, it's an actual return, was 5.27%, just in those 3 months. That's how it came up to 400 million. 427, actually. The return on the strategic asset allocation benchmark was 5.13%. So that's world. So in the world, the return on other sovereign wealth funds in the period October 2022 to December 2022 was 5.13%. Our fund managers returned 5.27%. So they beat the benchmark. For the particular year that was the subject of that unfortunate Express article, the benchmark return was 15.6% minus. So it was a negative minus 15.6%. So when you look around the world, the benchmark in 2022 was that all funds lost an average of 15.6%. Our fund lost 16%. So you're right there in terms of the benchmark. Now, quite often, the fund managers beat the benchmark. If you go back over the last 7 years or so, and you look at all the reports, you will see in each of them, there's a comparison between what our fund managers achieved and what the international benchmark was. And quite often, I would say more often than not, they have beat the benchmark. And in 2022, they were almost directly in line with the benchmark. So when we were looking at the 2022 situation, I can tell you we weren't sitting down and sleeping. We in finance were talking to the central bank, talking to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund board all the time. And in fact, asked them to have regular discussions with the fund managers, regular discussions. Because when you're looking at your sovereign wealth fund and you're seeing it decreasing in value, as a Minister of Finance, I have to become concerned. And the advice we received after a lot of interrogation was, wait it out. Because what is happening in 2022 is completely unpredictable. You have the war in Ukraine, and then you have very high inflation in the United States, which caused the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. And let me explain that. The Federal Reserve is very different to our central bank. Our central bank, when it decides to make an adjustment to our interest rates, it's called the repo rate, they look at growth in the economy, they look at the unemployment situation, they look at money supply, they look at inflation. So look at a whole range of things and then make a decision. And this is why our central bank has kept our interest rate down. They haven't changed it. Whereas the Federal Reserve in the United States has been constantly increasing from almost 0 to up to 6-7%. That is because by law, the Federal Reserve must increase interest rates when inflation goes up. That's the law under which they operate. It's a very narrow law. We in Trinidad and Tobago are not fettered by that kind of law. So that the fund managers said, wait it out. And it proved to be correct. As I indicated, we recovered $750 million in the last 9 months. In fact, if you go a little back in September, I was looking at it. If you go back to the 23rd of September, the annual report was to the 30th. The fund actually recovered $850 million over the last 9 months because of the expertise of the fund managers. And this is what happened all over the world. When the Norwegian fund lost 160 billion and the other sovereign wealth fund, Saudi Arabia, lose 24% of its value, they have fund managers too. And they all advised, this is geopolitics at its worst, ride it out. And you see the resurgence. I looked at the Dow Jones today, it's up. When you look at the performance of the US stock market in 2022, it crashed. And it's simply because of interest rates. I need to understand the relationship. When interest rates go up, people sell their stocks and their equities and they invest in fixed deposits. Right now, you could get 6 months treasuries in the United States for 4%. Unbelievable. 3 years ago, it was 0.1%, that kind of thing. So I hope that answers your question. Okay?
Minister, just before you leave, the explanation, the detailed explanation you gave at the start for the fluctuations in the performance, was that available in the report itself? Because I'm wondering now, if someone read the report and saw the figures, the 913 million drop, whether there was context within the report itself for understanding what took place.
Thank you very much for that question. The Heritage and Stabilization Fund Board publishes annual reports every year. You can go on the web, you'll see the report for 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, all the way up to 2022. By law, which is something I expect the media to know, the board is required to report, and I am required to lay in Parliament the report 4 months after the end of its fiscal year, which kind of mirrors ours. So I was required to send the 2022 report, and they were required to report to me by the end of January 2023. And I did send it to the Parliament, and on the first available opportunity, 3rd of February, I laid it. It was tabled. You can't read these things in isolation. I want you to understand the other point I made. Between 2015 and now, with the ups and downs, the fund has generated $2 billion in revenue. That's a net figure. So if you take out the 900, it means it generated $3 billion in revenue. When you even it out, you get $2 billion. So you see, it's unfortunate. If you're going to examine a complex topic, you need to understand what you're doing. You can't cherry pick. I use the examples of 2020. The fund, as I said, increased by $2 billion in 2 weeks. I remember one day, back in 17 or 18, as far as I can recall, the fund made a profit of $200 million in 1 day. Okay? You can't look at these things like that, because maybe a week later it might lose 100 million. You have to have a long-term vision. So when you're reading a report like that, you have to look at the quarterly report that comes afterwards, and you have to look at all the reports that went before, because it's long-term planning. You can't take one simple event over a continuum of 8 years. Okay?